Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Today I've got Kirk and Anders with me. And today we're talking about a decision by Meta, who have changed their hate speech policy regarding the word Zionism. Now, there's going to be a kind of, I guess, a lot of background debate about this. We're going to talk a bit about this decision itself. We might talk a bit about the idea of hate speech and whether we think there's kind of progress on the issue. But there's a tremendous amount of discussion amongst people about whether anti-Zionism is the same thing as anti-Semitism. Can you conflate those two things? Are there any contexts? And so on. Lots of people don't like to connect the two at all, whereas some people insist that it's quite important to do that. And so this is the kind of things we're going to be diving into today. So, Anders, I'll come to you first. What did you think when you saw about this decision?
Well, first, let me preface this by saying that um, I think, Facebook is a private company. They have the right to do, or Meta, to do whatever they want in this area. This is not a free speech issue. If anybody would go down into that rabbit hole. So they have the right to do whatever they want. They have an oversight board in place since a number of years. Because this content moderation, they have to do content moderation, obviously, because we know where things go when someone say all hands off and this is free speech and all that stuff. And it seems to always descend into something where the worst elements on the internet to get the upper hand. So I'm all for content moderation. Now, then the question is, how do you do this? And so Facebook or Meta, they have their oversight board. I think they implemented it in 2020, 2021 or something. You can go out there and actually look it up online. And it's really hard, content moderation, because for a company like Meta, they're covering the globe. And the use of one word can mean different things in different cultures and different countries around the world. You can even listen to episodes out there of podcasts that actually describe the process of how they do this. And you get an appreciation for the difficulty, the challenge of doing this. So their board now is comprised of academics and journalists and people from all over the world. You can look at who we are on their website and you see that, and then you can think what you want about it. But they really seem to, and by the way, this board is independent of Meta. So they have called it the Supreme Court of Oversight. And so users of Meta, if you're unhappy with something that if they have canceled you for some reason, you can appeal to this board. There's a process in place, I believe. And Facebook can appeal to the board as well. So they're I guess, in that sense, independent of Meta and Facebook. Now, then getting to the issue of anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, and we have read a couple of articles here in advance of this show, and the description, it seemed to me to be a very reasonable decision, well articulated, and so they will ban now the use of anti-Zionism if it implies kind of a hatred of Jews in general and Israel as a state. And they tie that to some other decisions that they have made in the past. So to me, it seems to be a reasonable decision.
Still on mute. Kirk, what did you make of the decision?
I agree with a lot of what Anders said, that Facebook, it's worth reminding, is a private company and they can declare their community guidelines however they see fit. I think it's also worth adding that I think Anders alluded to this, that it's a global company, Facebook. I think they have either hundreds of millions or billions of users. And I think whenever we're talking about social media, I think it's impossible to please everyone involved whenever making a decision like this. You're talking about they have to please users, they have to please sponsors and customers, they have to please shareholders. Probably we can probably throw government regulators, unfortunately, into this conversation. And it's chances are when you're operating a company where you are appealing to or trying to appeal to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, whatever decision you make is probably going to alienate and anger a lot of those people. So I think that that's worth keeping in mind. And yeah, I do think some form of content moderation is necessary. Sometimes the debate about how to go about it can get a little tricky at times. But yeah, as a user of social media, and I've had this feeling with Elon Musk, I've liked some of the decisions he's made, but in some respects, Twitter has gotten a lot worse with a lot of just the insanity and craziness I've seen on Elon Musk's website ever since he really took it over. And on top of that, I know there's this debate about, sanction. I know this mostly an issue with objectivists, the issue of sanction. Do you want to like promote or sanction ideas that you find vile, evil, horrible? I'm not, maybe we should be holding social media companies to this standard, but I don't think they operate on that standard. But then there's also this debate, this perspective of what's called sunlight is the best disinfectant. Hey, yeah, a lot of people have crazy, horrible ideas. Maybe it's better that we let them say it out loud on Facebook or Elon Musk's website or YouTube or whatever. Then we can have a conversation about it. People also frame this as the marketplace of ideas. I never really liked that. I get the perspective, but I don't really agree with that perspective. But I do understand it. I sympathize with it. If anti-Semitism is a growing trend, it's worth talking about. It's worth having a conversation about what are the roots, how did we get here, what are the best ideas to combat that. And then on top of that, we have to consider the fact that when a company like Facebook does impose these kinds of community guidelines, a lot of innocent people will be swept up in them. And I personally have experience with this, not with the issue of anti-Semitism, but with the issue of vaccines. I do a YouTube channel where I was posting weekly videos, and back in late 2021, I put up a video about talking about why I think Joe Biden's attempts to mandate vaccines through OSHA regulations was a form of fascism. I'm a big fan of vaccines, especially the new mRNA technology, but I don't like the government using the power of regulatory agencies an attempt to force it and impose it on people. I think that's horrible. And when I put out a video expressing that, YouTube immediately gave me a community guideline strike and wouldn't let me publish the video because to them they thought I was just putting out like anti-vax nonsense. And even when I appealed, I came up short on it. So I do get the perspective that trying to impose such community guidelines might end up in innocent people getting their accounts shut down or suspended or demonetized, and that's a whole other issue. And I can imagine a scenario where someone might want to like maybe they're reacting to a video where they're reacting to like some anti-Semite and debunk it and addressing their claims, and then it gets flagged because we detected anti-Semitism in this video. I think we need to keep in perspective that even if we agree with the content moderation, it can be tricky to apply, and people might get swept up in it.
Yeah, I'll echo what you guys said. I think that Meta and Twitter and all of these social media companies have a really difficult time trying to control exactly what goes on there. And I never used Twitter before Musk owned it, but I hear a lot the kind of thing that you said, Kirk, that basically it seems to have got a lot worse in terms of the kind of nastiness of a lot of the content on there. And I certainly don't envy them the job of trying to pick through what language people are using on their platform in the case of Meta. But in terms of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, it's a debate that can get really, really bitter about whether there's any connection between these two things. And certainly in the UK in recent years, there's been parties like the Labour Party, which is obviously now the party of government, which were kind of mired in scandal. For example, because one of their former mayors had said that Hitler was a Zionist. And now people obviously scratched their head at that description and said, "What on earth do you mean?" And so these seem to be terms which people even get mixed up about. And in a simple sense, there's a very meaningful way in which we can distinguish them. Obviously, anti-Semitism is referring to bigotry or prejudice against Jewish people, And someone who is an anti-Zionist, I suppose, is someone who is against a Jewish homeland. Some people describe anti-Zionism as being against a Jewish supremacist state. Um, some people might be anti-Zionist if they're against the current Israeli government, perhaps, maybe rather than against Israel in principle. These are the kind of two different meanings. And some people will make quite a simple argument, I guess, and say, look, Israel isn't the same thing as Jewish people, and anti-Zionism is being against Israel. Therefore, these things are different. Now, if we were being sort of very literal-minded, very narrow-minded about this, I think that's true. And I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that. But I think there are kind of more nuanced discussions that go on, which platforms like Meta are going to have to be really attentive to, and where actually there is a connection between these two things. So I think probably what we're going to end up talking about are uses of Zionism by the left. But I think in more uncontroversial examples for years and years and years, I think you'll find examples of the anti-Semitic far right using Zionism to refer to Jewish people. I remember kind of watching a documentary when I was a kid about the far right in America, for example, where these kind of real, neo-Nazi types were saying that their government was being controlled by Jews, except very often what they would say is that this was a government occupied by Zionists. This was a Zionist occupied government, for example. And I think in that example, it's probably less contentious for people now when people are kind of mired in the back and forth of being tribal, arguing back and forth about Israel on Twitter, for example, not wanting to concede any ground. It's probably not so contentious for people to recognize that the way Zionist is being used there is just to refer to Jewish people. And then, well, one, I want to just focus on this point. How do you guys think about a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Do you feel sympathetic towards the people who want to have a kind of cast iron distinction, or do you think that's maybe a bit too simplistic? Because my view is that it's a bit too simplistic. But Anders, I'll come back to you. What do you think?
Well, I think there was a more valid use of the term anti-Zionist in the past, but it has kind of been become a proxy for anti-Semitism. So, I mean, there are valid criticisms of the Zionist experiment, right? For example, if the Israeli government or individuals confiscated Palestinian or Arab property, without sufficient compensation and using eminent domain or whatever they call it in Israel, I mean, that's a valid criticism. But when the state of Israel started and the Zionists moved in there in the latter half of the 19th century, early 20th century, most of them, they bought property from Arabs who were willing sellers of it. So in that sense, you can, and today Israeli state, I mean, it's a welfare state, so we can make the same criticisms of Israel as a welfare state as we do of the United States, of the UK, etc. And but that, I mean, I don't see really why that would qualify as anti-Zionism, because it's just a general criticism of the welfare state. But today, I think, as it has been used, especially since October 7th, it's a straight up cover for anti-Semitism, in my opinion.
Kirk, what do you think?
I think in general, people should probably be suspicious of those who choose to define themselves by a negative, by being anti something instead of pro something. So, for example, I am a pro individual rights, free market. I like secular government, separation of church and state, and someone could probably presume by that I'm not a big fan of, say, Israel and them mingling stuff like religion and state with in its founding. Yeah, I do have a problem with that. But then at the same time, Israel does respect individual rights to a great degree, especially when compared to its neighbors and its enemies. And people who like to, claim, well, anti-Zionism, we're just, we don't like, mingling religion and state and how it manifests in Israel. It's like, okay, fine, but you should probably be at least equally as concerned as Israel's enemies, especially the countries that are at war with them, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And from what I can tell, a lot of these anti-Zionists, they don't really make that big of a fuss about that. They don't really seem interested in that distinction. And I've seen this before with, I remember years ago, there was a story about my alma mater and how the white nationalist group Patriot Front was putting up posters around campus. And some of the posters were like anti-communism. Hey, we're never going to have communism here. And when my university's newspaper was posting this, a lot of people are like, "Yeah, what's wrong with hating communism? Communism's terrible." It's like, yeah, I'm an anti-communist, but only because I'm pro-free market, pro-capitalism, pro-individual rights. But I don't define myself as being anti-communist. And when you see the organization that puts up these flyers talking about how horrible communism is, when you go to their website, you find out what they're really for, and it's something really ugly and horrible. So I think we also saw this with the whole Antifa debate. A lot of Antifa apologists, the Antifa rioters, they go smashing windows in the streets, and people say, "Oh, who has a problem with that? They're just anti-fascists. What are you, pro-fascists?" Like, yeah, but what does Antifa really stand for? What are these guys really fighting for? Chances are the best thing you could say is they're fighting for nothing. Like, okay, they're going to fight fascism. What governing philosophy do they have to oppose to that as an alternative? The best you can say is nothing, in which case, why would you go along with their cause? Chances are, though, they have a very horrible alternative, and they're hoping that you won't be curious enough to ask what exactly that is.
So I think as I kind of suggested, Daniel was having a go at me for using the word simplistic, by the way, but I'm probably going to continue using it. So I hope everyone can deal with that. But I think, as I've already suggested, I think that the people who are saying there's absolutely no context or anything where you can see a connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, I think are really trying to kid themselves. I think they're trying to keep be so literal minded and kind of narrow visioned that it suggests something almost like a guilty conscience about it, I think. And so I mean, and the basic reason why is that I think in the example I gave of the far right people, there are lots of people who will use the term Zionism as a way of referring to Jewish people without actually having to say it. And this is a kind of, I guess, wonderful thing if you're an anti-Semite since the creation of the state of Israel. You can suddenly use the word Zionism, and it doesn't seem quite so harsh. And for people in the modern context, they can just say, "Oh, well, I'm an anti-Zionist. I'm not an anti-Semite." And that's a common refrain that we hear coming up all the time, and which we certainly heard coming up a lot since the outbreak of the war. I'm just a critic of the state of Israel. I don't believe in a Jewish supremacist state. That's all that I am. I have no problem with Jewish people. And I think there are probably a lot of people who are critics of the state of Israel who define themselves as pro-Palestinian, and yet don't really hold a kind of strong animus in their chests about it. It's one of these things that's sort of very tricky to walk the line on in distinguishing this. But unfortunately, what we've seen on the left as well, not just in the far right example, are a lot of people who their kind of obsession with Israel in a way that they aren't obsessed with other people. Some of the allegations they're making against Israel, which are echoing the kind of old anti-Semitic tropes of kind of controlling the world, blood libels, having an obsession with killing children. All of these things, I think people get the feeling, yeah, there's something kind of anti-Semitic about what you're saying against Israel. There's something off here, there's something really quite strange. So that's my view on it. And we can probably delve into that a bit more. But something else, another way that people make this claim that I guess I'm basically supporting that there are lots of contexts where anti-Zionism connects with anti-Semitism. Some people say that anti-Zionism per se is anti-Semitic, and what they'll mean by that is if you don't believe in a state of Israel, for a kind of Jewish homeland or a safe country for Jews to go to that's specifically created for that purpose, then you're an anti-Semite. And that's a position I hear a bit more amongst Israel's defenders. Now, I wanted to hear what you think about that because, for example, some people who I think are quite articulate, and in many ways, I think can articulate a good defense of Israel, will make that case. For example, Einat Wilf. I don't know if you guys have ever come across her. Actually, I think I linked you to one of her videos before we started the episode today. This is the kind of case that she makes, and actually, well, I want to hear what you think because, I mean, in a sense, I'm not too settled on that. So, Anders, what do you think about people who say that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic?
Yeah, again, I would probably draw a line at October 7th. And as I said before, I think it has become pretty much synonymous. There may be people out there who are honestly the old-fashioned anti-Zionists, if you like, who have some valid arguments for or against the state of Israel. I don't know what they would be because I'm a pro-Israel person. But again, since October 7th, I think the burden of proof are on the people who call them today. Now, unfortunately, the burden of proof are on the people who call themselves anti-Zionists to prove that they're not anti-Semites, because that's pretty much where we are, the public debate, in my opinion.
Kirk?
I'm not sure if I would say anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitism. I would say that if you were to create a Venn diagram between anti-Semites and anti-Zionists, it's pretty much a circle, not all the way there. I'm sure you can find a handful of people here and there who are anti-Zionists, but not anti-Semites. But I think, as Anders alluded to, you would have to ask them, and as Mary Eileen said in the chat, like, but what are you for? Yeah, that's an important question. Okay, you're anti-Zionist, but from what context, from what perspective? Are you cheering for Hamas? Are you cheering for the PLO, which is they advocate for Arab nationalism, which is not much, if any, better? And from what I can tell, considering that Israel is at war with regimes that are 1,000 times worse than they are, maybe the time to have this discussion of moving Israel into a more secular position should probably be had after Israel is done warring with enemies who want to take any baggage you might accuse Zionists of having. They take it to an insane extreme, as we can see.
Yeah, I second that point, Kirk. I think, it's really important. So if someone tells you that they're an anti-Zionist, so if you want to dig deeper, ask them what they're for, and that will probably tell you pretty quickly if they're anti-Semite or not.
Yeah. I think where people get into the weeds with this is there's a lot of people who I think are almost kind of thrown into the discussions around the conflict and maybe pick up labels like anti-Zionist and without having a full sense of the context of them. So I think there would probably be a lot of young people who believe that they're very much in favor of kind of human rights and they're against suffering in the world and they're peace activists, they're anti-war. And so they would see the conflict break out on October 7th. Let's say they're 18, so they would have been still in their kind of mid-teens the last time any of the violence broke out and maybe just not paying attention to the news. And therefore these people might label themselves anti-Zionists. I think there are some students at universities like this, although certainly I don't think this applies to all of them, who would then say, I'm an anti-Zionist, and yet don't kind of hold any prejudice or bigotry against Jewish people. But unfortunately, as I say, some of the things that we've seen even on university campuses since October 7th and since the kind of campus intifada, as Razi's labeled it, in recent months, where there is a kind of really vicious anti-Semitism. Now, in the case of Einat Wilf, who is making this kind of criticism that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, I think she does recognize these kind of maybe more nuanced examples where someone just doesn't have a bit more of the full context and so on. But I think the point that someone like Einat Wilf is really making is that if you don't believe in a safe place for Jewish people to go, in a Jewish home state where they can go and be protected. You're anti-Semitic, or perhaps not in intention, but almost in consequence, I think is her position, because then Jewish people are going to be deprived of that safe space. We know that Jewish people are still suffering prejudice in the world. And so, and as you say, Anders, with October 7th going on, or post October 7th, I think a lot of people have had it impressed on them the necessity of there being a state of Israel for Jews to go to in these kind of times. And I think that's the kind of case that Einat Wolf would make, is that this is, you can't distinguish these two things in that circumstance. I think actually I've heard even Benjamin Netanyahu say this, that he doesn't make a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But although I think I said before that I think there really can be situations where there's a connection between these two things, I'm sympathetic to what someone like Netanyahu is saying there, but as I say, it feels a bit too simplistic. It feels simplistic the other way, but this feels a bit too simplistic as well, because it doesn't seem to account for some of these people. Now, maybe these people are just ignorant. I'm describing them as situations where students should know better and yet don't know better. But we'll see. I need to hammer out my thoughts. But I'll just get to a couple of our super chats. So we have $3 from Mary Aline. Thank you very much. And Mary Aline gives another $5 on top of that. Thank you. Who says, you can't ban hate, but you have a right to moderate content on your private platform. I think that's right, Mary Aline. And I think perhaps we're going to come back around to this, because we're going to be discussing the whole idea of hate speech. And then Mary Aline again, $2, who says, ask people nicely, but what are you for? I think that was the one that you mentioned, Kirk. So guys, I mean, if you were if you were speaking to, oh, maybe I've already asked you this, but if you were speaking to Benjamin Netanyahu and he said, I make no distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, I don't know, would you push back against that? Or would you feel comfortable in that sense that he's meaning that if there's no home state for Jews, then really this is almost anti-Semitism in consequence, because an awful lot of Jews are going to be suffering from the prejudice that we unfortunately know is still very present in the world. And Anders, I'll come back around to you.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it would be interesting to sit down with Bibi and have a chat with him. For sure, appreciate that. But I was thinking, so, I mean, the state of Israel, I mean, it's a complicated history, but today I pretty much see it as an established fact that there is a state. We can discuss the details, but not its existence or not. That discussion has been had and has passed, and it is what it is. And I find it interesting that this is still such a contentious. Well, I understand why it is, but it's interesting, and I think this has an anti-Semitic angle to it. But the fact that Israel is the one country in the world where this is never or has never been settled. I mean, if you look around the world, look at Europe, for instance. God, we have redrawn borders over and over and over again. And yes, there are some nationalist tendencies in parts of Europe, but for the most part, you know, it's not like we're obsessing over this and think that, you know, well, maybe we should revive the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or Prussia should be its own country separate from Germany or whatever. No, but for some reason, this never dies down when it comes to the state of Israel. And I think that definitely has anti-Semitic roots. I can't explain it any other way.
Kirk?
So Bibi Netanyahu says he does not make the distinction. Like, what context is that in? Is that just like in his like efforts to wage wars in self-defense? Is it to maybe crack down on free speech within Israel? Is there like I guess I'd ask him like in what context Does he think that there are any legitimate criticisms of, mixing religion and state? I don't know. I guess it'd have to require conversation. I will add, though, yesterday I listened to a lot of Yaron Brooks programming, and yesterday on his July 9th episode, he was really going off on Benjamin Netanyahu and a lot of the insanity within the Israeli government and a lot of their policies, especially pertaining to this war and how Israel is going through a recession right now, partly because they have not been waging this war effectively, and they may or may not be willing to compromise now. And the fact that I guess Orthodox Jews are exempt, or is it, I don't know if it's Orthodox or like a certain like sect of like religious Jews are exempt from the draft, which is outrageous. I mean, the fact that they have a draft is outrageous. And the fact that there are like welfare benefits to certain demographics of people and how that's been such a drain. And overall, the war has been a drain on the economy. And maybe this wouldn't be happening if the war were wrapped up by now. And anyway, I'd highly recommend everyone check that out if anyone wants a reasonable criticism of the government of Israel these days.
Yeah, I mean, and we didn't have to focus too much on the literal example of Benjamin Netanyahu, but I think where I'm thinking of that from when he did an interview with Lex Friedman. I think Lex Friedman actually asked him this exact question is there a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And he said that he just doesn't make a distinction between these two things on the grounds that
Okay.
if on the grounds that if there is no home for Jews to go to, then in consequence, what really is the difference? And certainly, I when you're saying, Anders, that there's kind of overtones of anti-Semitism to the fact that the question of is the state of Israel legitimate and does it have the right to exist? I've heard a lot of people point out that kind of thing that there with many other countries in the world, and many which are less legitimate from a rights and freedom protection perspective than the state of Israel. We don't discuss whether they're legitimate, whether they have the right to exist, and whether they should just go away. Whereas with Israel, this question is sort of ever present, and that there does seem something uncomfortable and anti-Semitic about that. Um, my line of thought was just escaping away from me. But oh, yes, I remember. So although I'm sympathetic as well, I think to the idea that there has to be a state of Israel for Jews to go to. Um, Part of me does, I'm in two minds about it. Part of me doesn't feel like it's quite right to say that um, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are completely separate in all contexts in which those words are being discussed, and yet at the same time, I don't think they're exactly identical as well. And I think you have to kind of think carefully about the way people are using it in the various situations. Then at the same time, when you're talking to someone who considers themselves an anti-Zionist, if what they're in favor of, for example, like Roger Waters, who we were talking about on the channel a little while ago, is just the creation of a single state in the area right now without any change and without any actually uh, without any Israel to protect the Jewish people there. You're just going to create a one state over Gaza and the West Bank and Israel as it is now. I think, unfortunately, what you're going to do is unleash a lot of violence upon the Jewish people there. And someone like Roger Waters is in favor of kind of repatriating Jewish people to Europe because he thinks that's where they came from originally. There's a huge amount of anti-Semitism to that, I think, and I think it makes a lot of sense that a lot of Israelis um, feel a lot of anti-Semitism in the suggestion that the state of Israel just needs to kind of be wrapped up and put away, or that they in any way need to go back to the United States or Europe or so on, as Roger Waters was saying. And he gets the allegation of anti-Semitism a lot. And I don't think that it's an accident that that's coming about, or people just being imprecise. I think there really is something that sounds anti-Semitic about that. Now, coming back to the the original launching point of the Meta policy, this is obviously an update to their hate speech policy. And hate speech is another one of these really contentious areas in recent years. And I wanted to ask what you make of the whole idea of hate speech. So, Anders, in a sense, I want to say, do you think this is progress? Because I think, obviously on the channel, we're very concerned about anti-Semitism. But do you think that it's right for a company like Facebook to have a hate speech policy pertaining to this area? Do you think this has been a good thing?
if they want to call it hate speech policy or anti-hate speech policy, I think that's in their rights to do that. And hate speech as such, I think it's a very slippery slope. But as long as it is contained to the marketplace of ideas, and in the private marketplace, I mean, we can dislike the use of it and say that it's not precise enough and it is a slippery slope. But where I object to its use is in a legal context, where government gets involved and define hate speech, because then we're getting very quickly into the territory of free speech and censorship and such. So as long as if it were limited to a discussion in the private marketplace, it's just like any other term. I think it wouldn't pose a threat really to anybody, and it would flush itself out over time. But I do have a big problem with it being the foundation of a lot of laws and regulations in many countries.
Kirk, are you troubled by either public platforms like or private companies, maybe I should say, like Facebook having hate speech policies, or do you think this is the right thing for them to be doing?
I mean, I hate anti-Semites. Am I going to get purged by these hate speech policies? I guess that'd be my first question. Like, I don't think hate is always a bad thing. I think it depends on do you have a rational justification for hating someone or some group of people like anti-Semites and racists? I hate racists. Am I allowed to hate racists? Is Ayn Rand Center UK going to get kicked off YouTube for all this hate speech I'm spreading right now? So guess that's how I would ask of it. But again, these are private companies. It's not always easy to figure out. And even when they have, I would say, reasonable content moderation, like, yeah, I don't really care to see anti-Semitism on Facebook, but sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, when applying it, some people who are not hateful, not anti-Semitic, might get accidentally suspended or whatnot because the algorithms misdetected some anti-Semitism or whatever, or someone was pushing back against anti-Semitism, and then they got detected, and then I don't know what we call them, the Supreme Court of content moderation maybe doesn't really have the time to go through each and every case, so I don't know.
I think broadly, I feel quite resistant to the idea of hate speech in the sense that, although maybe I'd need to flesh this out by thinking about exactly more and exactly what I would think that hate speech is something of an invalid concept, which is an invalid concept for people who are, less familiar is an idea in objectivism, which is just saying this isn't a valid idea, that it's in some way either
Yeah.
divorced from reality or poorly formed. And so I would have to think hate speech is an invalid concept. And I certainly agree, Anders, that I'm very concerned about countries around the world which are increasingly introducing hate speech laws. Even here in Scotland, we've spoken a bit on the channel about the strengthening of hate speech laws in Scotland. And really, once you're
That's what I'd be mostly concerned about. Not what private companies are doing, but what governments are doing. And we've even seen that in the United States, which has robust First Amendment protections. But we've seen these acts from Congress that want to like make a package deal out of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And then you have congressmen like Thomas Massey, who say like, look, I'm not going to sign on to this because I'm not a Zionist, but I don't like anti-Semitism either. But if you're going to combine the two, then I can't vote for it. And then he gets smeared as an anti-Semite as a result.
yeah, for sure. And certainly,
Yeah, I
going on.
agree. Invalid concept is probably the correct label of it. And as Kirk said, there are valid reasons for hating stuff. So, and it's a little bit the same as extremist. I'm a proud extremist for capitalism. Does that put me in the camp of extremists for the annihilation of the state of Israel? It's depends on context.
Mm. I remember seeing someone make a post somewhere of a quote from Harry Binswanger from, I think it must have been a few decades ago now, talking about the word extremism, just since you brought it up, Anders, he said something along the lines of extremism is an invalid concept which invalidly groups together the good and the bad. Oh, no, the very, very good and the very, very bad on the grounds that they're both very, very, which I thought was which was a funny way of putting it, and I think put his finger on it. Um, but yes, so I think in cases like Scotland, you can't create a hate speech law without actually infringing upon free speech. And that's something I've been very concerned about in recent months since they've introduced these heightened restrictions on what counts as hate speech and expanding the legal definition of hate speech and creating a crime about stirring up hate and so on. But in this case, where Meta is a private company and has a hate speech policy, although I'm resistant about that, even that term being brought in, because I'd worry about it corrupting what they're doing a little bit. I think as I think you, Kirk, and I think you, Anders, were saying at the beginning, I'm really sympathetic to the idea that as a platform, as a social media platform, you don't want to just be hosting anything. And I think there is you get because you're mixing, I guess, free speech, which is an idea to do with more to do with the government, and whereas what we're talking about here are private companies. When people talk about Twitter being a free speech platform, for example, I think it ends up getting a bit confused because these private companies can change their policy about what exactly the content they want to be hosting on there without actually censoring people in the way that we would use censorship as pertaining to free speech. But so I'm sympathetic to them to want to curate that, especially when you get into the really nasty examples in other areas, like I guess even just like bullying that people experience on Facebook, especially when we're talking about young kids and the nasty consequences that can have. Um, the sort of racist comments people will make on Facebook or on Twitter. And as you say, Kirk, it's gotten worse on Twitter. There are people, the platforms feel like they don't want to be a home for those kind of things. And so I'm really sympathetic to their want to control it. And in the case of the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism discussion, I think it probably is a good thing. And it probably is a kind of progress that Meta has recognized that there are situations where people are using Zionism just as a kind of cover to get around, to be anti-Semitic and get themselves a bit of cover while doing that. But I mean, I think it's basically a good thing, even if there's something wrong with hate speech policies, per se. And even if, as you say, Anders, it's not wrong to be hateful of something intrinsically. There are many situations where you should hate things. You should hate anti-Semites, as you said, Kirk. I think probably it's a good thing that Facebook has recognized that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have some connections in some conversations and circumstances. But okay, guys, just as we're coming into the final few minutes of the show, I'll just read out one more super chat we have. We have £5 from PC, who said, some guy on Facebook said Israel wants to throw all Arabs out. Nonsense. Certainly, those kind of things get brought up and alleged against Israel a lot of the time. Perhaps that was in relation to when we were talking about anti-Zionists defining themselves as people who are against a supremacist state. Perhaps that's where PC was drawing that from. But are there any other areas surrounding this that you guys want to hit upon? Anders?
Well, if you're not happy with the term hate speech, mount a campaign to get rid of it. Contact Facebook, contact online platforms. It's in the marketplace of ideas. These are things that you can change over time, and public opinion can be swayed. But and as long as it stays out of the hands of government, I don't really see it as a threat.
Mm. I think just the area where, even in this private context where I feel wary about the idea of hate speech is and I think you agree with this based on what I've heard you just say. People will say something along the lines of, you people can say what they like, they just can't be hateful. And I think part of the problem there is that if you're trying, even in these private contexts, if you're trying to kind of rule out any hatred per se on anything, even someone hating really quotidian things, like a certain type of food, for example, you're going to have a real problem, and people end up sounding a bit abstract and a bit strange when they're talking about hate per se as being a kind of as being a problem that people need to abolish from their lives because hatred is just an emotion.
Yeah, so that's where you drill down a little bit if you're interested enough, and you ask them, what do you mean? I mean, what's your definition of hateful? And then give them a couple of examples, like Kirk's, I hate anti-Semites. Is that bad? And if they're reasonable, they'll probably adjust their view and their use of the word.
Hmm. Kirk, any other areas that you want to hit upon?
No, I think that's it. Other than I might want to try to clarify the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and that is that, yes, from what I can tell, a lot of the people who fly under the banner and under the radar of anti-Zionism, reason why they're anti-Zionist is because they don't want to see Jews exist, succeed. They don't want them to have their own homeland. And in a lot of cases, those people are probably cheering for regimes like Hamas and Hezbollah and or the PLO, Arab nationalism, and which is not any better, by far not any better than what modern Israel is today. And from what I can tell, anyone who might have a somewhat rational justification for opposing Zionism. They are, from what I can tell, a microscopic portion of people who consider themselves anti-Zionist. So, again, if there was a Venn diagram, not exactly a full circle, but pretty close to it. And if you ever come across someone who's trying to fly under, hey, I'm just criticizing Israel. Hey, I'm just anti-Zionist. I'm not anti-Semitic. Ask them why. What are you for? What do you think the governing philosophy should be of modern day Israel? And are you supporting their war of self-defense against regimes who you would presumably be also opposed to?
Hmm. I think that's probably right, Kirk, that in figuring out the distinction between these two things, is someone just criticizing, I don't know, Israel's conduct in the war, or are these one of these people who are criticizing Israel's conduct because they're actually an anti-Semite? You need to talk to them and figure out exactly what their intentions are and where they're coming from.
Especially, yeah. I mean, it's sorry to cut you off, but like, especially like when you see all these like college protests and you see like people showing up with like Hezbollah flags and people like cheering on the Al-Qassam brigades, is like, yeah, maybe there's a little more than just anti-Zionism going on here. Maybe you guys are just going a bit above and beyond just criticizing Netanyahu or whatever.
Yeah, and certainly in those examples, those would have been people who would have said, "We're just anti-Zionists, we're not anti-Semites." And then if you were that girl who was holding up the sign, which I think you're referring to, that said Al-Qassam Brigade's next target or something like that, which is referring to Hamas, she was really saying this is Hamas's next target, pointing to some Jewish students. In that
Yeah.
case, I don't see how there's any way that what you're engaged in isn't really a form of anti-Semitism, because you're saying Hamas, which is an openly anti-Semitic organization, should come and kill these Jewish students. And in what other kind of situations would we sort of really sort of pain ourselves to kind of make these such fine distinctions and so on? And since Hamas are openly anti-Semitic, how are they? How can supporting them not be anti-Semitic in many ways? And that's part of what got someone like Jeremy Corbyn, the British politician who was recently re-elected to Parliament after being kicked out of the Labour Party. I think this is partly what got him into trouble, because a lot of people wanted to say Jeremy Corbyn is not an anti-Semite. He's never an anti-Semite. He's just an anti-Zionist. And yet, when he was referring to, he once hosted a talk, I think, around the Houses of Parliament, to which he said, "I've invited our friends Hezbollah and our friends Hamas." When you're referring to groups like Hezbollah and Hamas as your friends, I think obviously you seem like an anti-Semite. And in Jeremy Corbyn's case, I think it's more than just seemed. I think there is some anti-Semitism going on there. But
And I
okay,
think there was an infamous clip. He was on Piers Morgan a few months back, and Piers Morgan said, "Do you come?" And I think he refused to condemn Hamas, if I recall correctly. And just, yeah,
yeah, he's one of these people who, after he got kicked out of the Labour Party, stood at the recent election on a platform of, mostly being pro-Palestinian, and seemed to have got elected on that basis. And lots of people will feel very concerned about what the Labour Party's policy is now going to be. And there was even some talk just this morning I saw about Keir Starmer, who had committed himself not to going through with the ICC's arrest warrant against Netanyahu. That there was some signs that he was maybe wobbling on that, and that if Netanyahu came to the UK, he would consider going through with this arrest warrant and arresting him, which is a real shame. And unfortunately, I think these pro-Palestinian MPs who have come in are going to basically spend a huge amount of their time lobbying the Labour Party leadership to be more quote unquote anti-Zionist. And unfortunately, I think for some of them, at the very least, they've got a lot of anti-Semitism mixed up into their motivations. So I
Yeah,
think Kirk,
Jeremy Corbyn, anti-Zionist, but seemingly not anti-Islamic theocracy. Really makes you think.
yeah, you've got to ask yourself some questions around Jeremy Corbyn. Confusing guy. But all right, guys, we can wrap up just as we've got to the top of the hour. So thank you so much for watching, everybody. Thank you for joining me, Anders and Kirk. Anders, where can people find more of your work?
You can find my book, Think Right or Wrong, Not Left or Right, on any Amazon outlet around the world. And I'm on Substack, andersingemarsson.substack.com.
Fantastic. And Kirk, where can people find you?
You can find me at my YouTube channel. I think it's usually linked in the description. And yeah, I have a few videos on this topic that I've talked about today. One of them was from a couple months ago, All In with Double Standards, where I react to MSNBC's Chris Hayes, talking about the campus protests. I have another video from right around October 7th called The Myth of the Liberation Protest, where I talk a lot about this topic. I think I even have one from a few years ago where I was talking about anti or anti-Israel. I forget the title of the video, but and now I can't find it because it required me. But it is a topic I've been talking about for years, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So check out my YouTube channel if you want more commentary on this topic.
Fantastic. And you can find my Twitter, Morgan Carter 98, linked in the description. You'll find all of Anders and Kirk's links there as well. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. If you're going onto Facebook, be aware that you can't be an anti-Semite because Meta's not going to put up with it. But thank you so much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. Bye-bye.